find small caps in emerging markets a tremendously exciting investment opportunity. Really, I think the case would rest on three core areas. The first would be the extent to which these are under-researched companies. There's very little competition out there in terms of investment managers such as ourselves, or even the sell side that are investing in and researching these companies. Accordingly, by investing early, before the competition, before other investors, that tends to increase the opportunity for re-rating over time. As those stocks are added to various indices, as they grow, as investor interest increases, you typically do see quite a strong re-rating, which when paired with earnings growth can result in very strong returns. Furthermore, there's a fairly strong diversification element to these stocks as well. They tend to be disproportionately domestically orientated, and so in a world in which we're facing increased macroeconomic tensions, trading tensions, having that domestic orientation is a key advantage. But a further element of diversification comes from the fact that the investors owning these stocks tend to be different from the large cap stocks in emerging markets. As mentioned, these are under-researched. As a result, these are less crowded. You have much lower level of foreign ownership of many of these names, and so accordingly you typically have a higher degree of local ownership, of domestic ownership. And domestic investors don't necessarily behave in the same way as foreign investors, and so accordingly you get sort of a doubling up of that diversification. So domestic economic exposures through the companies, but then also exposure to domestic investor behavior, which can hence impact overall correlations and bring down the volatility. So contrary to expectations, actually small cap investing, particularly through our approach, has been lower volatility than large cap investing in emerging markets in recent years. So the great thing about small caps is, frankly, the country decision sometimes is much less relevant than it would be from a large cap perspective, precisely because the drivers of these company sort of performance tend to be much more idiosyncratic, much more driven by both those domestic exposures that the companies have and the domestic investor behavior. So there's much less of a top-down element that perhaps is involved when it comes to small caps, and accordingly we find opportunities across a very wide spectrum of countries. With that said, if we look at our key country exposures in our funds at the moment, the two markets that stand out would be India and China. Starting with India, this has been a tremendous market for us for many, many years. It's been a great example where you've seen domestic investor behavior driving returns. You've seen a very strong re-rating of small caps as domestic investors in India have bought into equity markets and driven those company names up. But simultaneously, it's also a stock picker's paradise. There's a lot of bad companies in the small cap space in India, but there's also a lot of excellent companies, and through focusing on these you can really generate very sustainable alpha. When it comes to China, this is now our largest market in the small cap space, and perhaps what is most interesting about that is that we accumulated a lot of that exposure over the last 18 months or so. Precisely when you've seen these top-down macro concerns impacting Chinese markets to quite a heavy degree. So we found that's provided an opportunity to buy a lot of high-quality names that are completely unimpacted by these trade tensions at cheaper prices, cheaper valuations, and where we see sustainable growth going forwards. Perhaps looking at a more niche market where we found opportunity, Vietnam stands out. This is a country that is off benchmark. It's a frontier exposure. It's an economy that has been developing very rapidly in recent years, and where we find the sort of twin drivers of infrastructure development and rising consumerism becoming more prevalent. And so accordingly we're seeking to take advantage of those two themes, as well as healthcare, as well as some other materials names, to generate returns as well. But that's a market that also stands to gain potentially from some of these trade tensions with China. So some positive top-down elements also.
投资一定有风险，基金投资有赚有赔，申购前应详阅公开说明书。